what we're seeing, John, is the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich that we have ever seen in our lifetime. It is the most massive exercise in virtue signalling, which will essentially do absolutely nothing for the planet, particularly out of a country like Australia, which is just over 1% of the world's emissions. And economies which now make up 60% of the world's carbon emissions have no intention of hitting net zero. And I don't want to see that dictated to by government, because it actually has no understanding how the world actually works. People have to understand that if they want the lifestyle that they're living now, which is essentially borrowed money, that money one day has to be paid for, and that's by future generations. There is enormous hope for the future as long as we husband our wealth and we look after our future generations by not squandering the resources that we have today and having them pay for the future.
Chris Uhlmann is a very well-known Australian journalist and news commentator with an enormous curiosity and massive intellectual reach. His career in the media spans over 35 years in radio, newspaper and television. I'm honoured to be able to talk to him in this conversation. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
No worries, mate. Good to be with you.
I'm deeply troubled that the research tends to suggest that most Australian voters still believe that renewables can do the task, that they're cheaper and they're up to it, despite the rapidly accumulating evidence in this country that they're not, and the overwhelming evidence internationally that once you go beyond 30, maybe 40% at the most renewables, and you mix, it all starts to go haywire and it's not cheaper. Are we living in the age of post-truth public debate?
Well, John, I think also that people don't really understand where their sources of power come from, their sources of food, their sources of wealth, and so they're now actively voting against them. And I think that when it comes to renewable energy, look, most people's experience of that is having solar power on their roof, and despite the fact that some of them expend tens of thousands of dollars to get it there, once it is there, they tend to think that the electricity that they got from it is free. And I think one of the really big problems that we've had in the course of the last several years in Australia is the ability to try and frame the argument in such a way that people will begin to understand about where the real cost drivers in their bill are. But that's the best evidence. People keep talking about modelling, right? So we talk about modelling, and when renewables are generating, they are the cheapest form of power. Well, of course, that may well be the case when they're generating. They mostly don't generate, and they need a massive life support system to keep them going. And it's the total bill that you pay for. So it's that electricity bill which is the best measure. That's the pulse of where the cost of power is. And at the moment, the government is keeping that suppressed, John, of course, by subsidising the cost of power. Now, if and when the Labor Party decides to stop doing that, then people will be exposed to the real cost of electricity, and maybe then more questions will be asked.
In broad terms, the cost of electricity in Australia has risen by around 70% over the last 10 years, as I understand it. That's a big rise in real terms.
Absolutely.
And what's more, the greater portion of that and the fastest rise in it has come with the increase in the penetration of renewables. It's also now acknowledged that it has damaged our GDP. We have a cost of living crisis. Why is it that it seems so difficult to get people to focus on reality that what we're doing is economically very damaging?
Yeah, and it is terribly difficult because mostly people don't understand the systems which keep them alive. And so electricity being one of the really important ones. And you're dead right. You can put a pin in when we started to increase the amount of renewables on the grid and track the rise of electricity prices alongside it. And the one example that I'd offer is South Australia, which has more wind and solar on the grid than anywhere else in Australia, and the highest electricity prices in Australia. So there's clearly a correlation there. And you and I both know that there's absolutely a correlation, because as you build these systems, you have to overbuild them, because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. You need some sort of backup. You need to spread these resources to the four corners of the earth in order to capture as much as you can. I think we've got to start changing the language, John. I don't think we should be calling wind and solar energy generators. I think we should be calling them energy gatherers, because that's essentially the way that they work. It's like throwing a net into the ocean. You get what nature gives you. And if nature does not give you energy, then you need to find that energy from somewhere else. South Australia is a good example, because what happens there is it's essentially kept alive, that system, by a lifeline that comes from Victoria and Victoria's brown coal-fired plants. Now, as those things shut down, the grid will become ever more unstable, both in South Australia and in Victoria, and then, of course, on through New South Wales and Queensland.
It's often said that energy is the economy. Not so often said it's also security. Why is energy security?
Well, think about your lifestyle, John. Again, people flick on a switch and their lights come on, and they don't really think about where that energy comes from. If that energy was to go, if that energy was to break down, then essentially it would be, we measure in a matter of days how long it would be before we'd have social unrest, because it keeps all of the other systems afloat. And you're right when you say energy is the economy, because it goes way beyond just electricity. And this is what people don't seem to understand. We are doing the easy part at the moment. We're changing the electricity grid. Well, that's the lower hanging fruit, and that's proving to be very difficult. We've got to work out ways that we can make steel, cement, ammonia, which feeds half the world's population by getting nitrogen out of the atmosphere through that Haber-Bosch process, which essentially feeds half the world's people, and plastic, which is ubiquitous in the environment. But without energy, we can't run our economy, and without our economy functioning, we can't have any sort of economic or national security. And in future, I would suggest that one of the problems that we're going to have in Australia is the ability to make the things that we need to defend ourselves as a nation. So it ricochets all the way through every part of your existence. Energy is life. Literally, your standard of living is measured by the amount of heat that you get to waste, whether you see it or not.
You've written very competently about the technical causes of the massive shutdown of electricity production in Spain and Portugal. And interestingly, it was triggered by too much sun. As you just said, many people are installing their own solar, and it feels good. They tend to discount how much it's been subsidised both by themselves and indirectly by taxpayers, but they feel good about it. In reality, if you end up with too much of it, it becomes nearly impossible to stabilise the grid. It breaks, and then it's nearly impossible to start again. They're difficult things for a layman, I think, to get their minds around.
Yeah, this is part
but
of
you explain in layman's language what happened in Portugal. It's happened in South Australia, I know, and why it would be even more catastrophic here, because we could not call in power from our neighbours the way they could, much of it, by the way, nuclear power. We might come to that in a moment, to restart their grid. In the meantime, they had no power, which is worse than expensive power.
Yeah, and so essentially, like the way to think about electricity is it's almost a magical system. Essentially, what you need is to match supply with demand, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can never have too little supply, because what happens is that the grid works on a system of 50 hertz, so sort of 50 cycles a minute. And if you go to a big coal-fired power station, the heartbeat of the system comes from those big spinning wheels that we've had in the system. They create what's called system inertia. They stabilize the system. And if there is any kind of shock to the system, then when it hits those big spinning wheels, they might shudder, but they keep spinning. So that's the thing that keeps the heartbeat of the system going. Wind and solar don't function like that. They don't create that kind of system inertia. And what we're seeing with particularly the explosion of rooftop solar is we're getting too much energy in the middle of the day, and those big spinning wheels have to shut down because we can't control that rooftop energy. So we have to start shutting down other parts of the system. What happened in Spain was there was way too much solar energy in the system and not nearly enough ability to stabilize it. So when there was a shock to the system, it essentially ricocheted all the way through it. It got up to there's an interconnector with France, which Spain connects through to its nuclear energy. But what happens is if that part of the system gets overloaded, that shuts down to protect the other side of the border. So inside this island of the Iberian Peninsula, there was not enough stability in the system to keep the lights on, and the entire thing collapsed. Now, when it does collapse, you have to be able to restart the system. And again, you can't restart an electricity grid with wind and solar. You need something that delivers what we call dispatchable power, something that burns fuel. So you have to start building that from that base upwards, and that's what you do. And then you build it outwards, and you set up the system security again, you set up the system harmony again, then begin connecting all the other bits and pieces to it. Again, these are highly complex bits of machinery that we know how they work, that we've been working on them for the last 150 years. Unfortunately now, we are trying to retool the system, essentially rebuild a plane while we are flying it with systems that we don't know whether or not they will be airworthy. That's the risk that we're putting into the system. So the two things that are going to happen with renewable energy, or wind and solar, as night follows day, is that the more that you get in the system, the riskier the system becomes, and the more expensive it becomes because it has to be so overbuilt. So it doesn't do any of the things that people said it was going to do. It makes a less reliable system, and it makes a more expensive system. And given you have to build so much of it, it's not green either, because we're churning up the landscape to put up wind turbines and solar panels.
Well, there are other aspects in which it's not actually green or renewable, for the simple reason that a so-called 82% reduction in emissions from power generation turns out to be vastly less than that, because you've got to make the solar panels, you've got to bring them here, you have to put them up. Same with turbines, you have to service them. Then in 20 years' time, you've got to pull them down, you've got to replace them. The whole procedure happens again. So you don't get anything like the claimed reduction in emissions, quite apart from the environmental issues that you're talking about.
It is the most massive exercise in virtue signalling, which will essentially do absolutely nothing for the planet, particularly out of a country like Australia, which is just over 1% of the world's emissions. So what we are doing now is engaging in extremely expensive exercise, because people see the imperative that we have to do something about climate change. But unfortunately, the problem for Australia is it won't do anything about that. And a large part of the rest of the world is not doing anything about trying to address their emissions at all. So we essentially are retooling our grid around a system which won't function, which will be highly expensive, and will deliver us into poverty, essentially. If we stay on this pathway, we will not be able to manufacture anything in Australia, because the other things that we're going to need, which manufacturing, as you know, a big part of that is industrial heat. We're not going to get that out of wind or solar either. What we're going to see is and we're seeing it already, is the shuttering of our industry around Australia as this kind of energy is rolled out, because it's inadequate for the purpose. We're going from a system that delivered us stable, affordable power in the 20th century to a system that's going to deliver us unstable, unaffordable power in the 21st. And think about this, John. You were in politics in Australia for a long time. Australia came to a settlement at the beginning of the 20th century, which was this, that we would be a high wage economy, but we were a low energy cost economy. So that equation worked for us. In the 21st century, we cannot be both a high wage and a high energy cost economy, because no one is going to pay the bill for our lifestyle.
It strikes me that reliability is probably even more important than price. What industry sector, you think smelting, that's a particularly poignant example. You get an interruption to power if it's not reliable. You can ruin billions of dollars worth of capital equipment very, very quickly. No one's going to do it. But then there are any other number of industry sectors that can't cope with unreliable power. And I wonder, how long will it be before some experts, in inverted commas, who really know the truth, that are, if you like, part of the propaganda machine around this, actually come clean and say, we are building something that can't be relied upon. You need to be aware of it. This goes to integrity in politics, Chris. We live in a country where you're absolutely free to say, our children are all in danger of whatever if we don't do something about climate change. We must make these measures, but it requires the honesty to say it does mean significant reductions, very real reductions in your living standards. It goes to integrity. Who's going to start to call this out from within? The people who must know. And I don't say that lightly, because I met a very senior official over a cup of coffee not long ago in Sydney. I can't, obviously reveal who it was. But I said, I've got some quite deep concerns about what we're being told by your organisation. I was flabbergasted when he said, so do I.
Yeah, John, and that really disturbs me because I've had the same conversations with people who run electricity retailers, for example, and people in industry who know that we're on the wrong path, but all want to sign up for a target like net zero because they feel that their shareholders want it or that the public wants it. And the public may well want it. What people need to do is to tell them the truth, that if we continue on this path, it's going to be very expensive. You will see the price in your electricity bill, and that will just be the beginning of it, because you'll also see the price in your food bill, because high electricity prices will drive the cost of everything up. You'll also see it in our manufacturing as the high costs of energy drives those sorts of things out of businesses, as jobs disappear. And let's not also forget, John, that if we are to stick to a net zero target, there's a very big circle that's been put right around some of our major exports, those of coal and those of liquefied natural gas. And of course, iron ore is very heavily intensive when it comes to using diesel. So just about wherever you want to look, Australia will pay a disproportionately high price for this. So look, in the end, I'm with you, John. If we're going to make this transition, then the one thing that we could demand of all of our leaders is simply this: tell the truth. What is the cost going to be? But we saw this through the last election with Chris Bowen, our energy minister, where he had promised a $275 reduction in bills by now. Now the Australian taxpayer is forking out $6.8 billion to try and dull the pain that's coming from their electricity bill. So there's this giant Ponzi scheme where we're taking money from taxpayers and then recycling it back into the bills of consumers and calling that cost of living relief. Well, you know, that is an extraordinary thing. The minister refused to even admit the fact that the electricity price was rising. You asked me at the beginning, are we in a post-truth environment? I never thought I would see the day where a minister in Australia, when confronted with a fact that he knows, would refuse to accede to it. But in the long run, John, physics will settle this debate. It will not be politics. And it will be price and physics which drives the public inevitably to start to question the pathway that we're on. But unfortunately, it might be too late.
Well, I noticed the same minister has said, well, you know, we've had an election about energy, and he said this afterwards. He's invisible during the campaign, as far as I could tell. But the Australian people have voted in favour. City and country Australians prefer renewables. We've had the debate, but we didn't have a debate. That's the point. And I would say that there is no greater issue confronting this nation now than the breakdown of trust. You can't go anywhere without trust. If we're not going to trust because we don't think they're trustworthy, our leaders on important issues, we're not going to be able to resolve any issues. We're not going to be able to come to grips with the challenges that are before us. So that's why I emphasise that I do think that those people, and I include the Greens and a lot of the Labor Party in this, and I'll be frank, more coalition members than I'd like, who say we must go down the renewables road, but then try to pretend we can do it without cost, because we can't.
No, we can't do it without cost, and we can't do it without extraordinary engineering challenges. And as I say, John, we're just on the beginning of the pathway for this. And I don't think that people really appreciate, like, you know, net zero was something that came out of the Paris Accords, right? So that's not that old. We're talking about the middle of the last decade that the world started to sign up for this. And it wasn't signed up to in Australia by Scott Morrison until 2021. So it has a fairly limited life so far. But if you asked 100 Australians what net zero meant, I bet you at least 99% of them couldn't tell you what it meant. But again, this is where language is a difficult thing. And I think that this is one of the things that the Liberal Party, the Coalition, and the people who are trying to talk some energy realism have to do, is to start to work out the language, the way to speak to people. And something like net zero, it's not just about the electricity system. It's about every aspect of your life. What we will see if we continue on the pathway to net zero is permanent COVID-style interventions in your lifestyle forever, because it means you're going to have to change the way that you eat. You're going to have to change the way that you live. People keep talking about demand management. You'll hear these terms which are code for energy rationing. Now, I got a notice from my retailer the other day. It's ActuAGL in the ACT was talking to me about the fact that the solar feed-in tariffs were being cut. And then it gave me a list, John, of the things that I could do in a place like Canberra, as you would know, gets extremely cold during the winter. One of the suggestions that it had was to use energy for heating your house in the middle of the day and turn the heating off at night. Well, at night time in Canberra, the temperature drops well below zero. And there are going to be many people in Canberra who won't get a choice. And people in communities around places like that in the southern parts of Australia, we will see a rise, and we already are, of energy poverty in Australia as people are simply unable to afford their power bills. We're also seeing with all the subsidies that are coming in for solar panels, for batteries, for electric vehicles, they're being sucked up by the wealthy. What we're seeing, John, is the greatest transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich that we have ever seen in our lifetime. And we're going to see an increase in energy poverty in Australia and people sitting in the dark.
Well, that's one set of trust-breaking realities. We're not being told the truth about the economic cost. There's two other great moral issues, well, one particularly moral, one slightly more economic, that we need to confront. I wonder how many young people are really aware of the hopelessness of trying to feed the globe's population without vast quantities of affordable fossil fuel energy at this point in time. I'm a farmer, and I'm very, very interested, as you know, Chris, in the business of feeding people in less fortunate parts of the world. We've made terrific progress, much better progress than we ever give ourselves credit for. Lifespans in much of the third world have doubled in the last 50 years. The, stunted children numbers and so forth, it's still too high, but it's way down on what it was. You mentioned it. 50% of the world's grain production is dependent at this stage on artificial fertilizers. Agriculture is around 14% of emissions. Transport, another 14, 15%. You won't get anything on your dinner plate, and you won't get your toilet paper either, for that matter, at the supermarket, without diesel, without fossil fuels at the moment. There's that aspect of it. There's another that's being missed. Our young people who have a moral conscience need to stop and consider, those economic and humanitarian realities. But there's another one. We're going to need vastly more power, not less, in the future because of data centers and AI and those things that will be critical to our children having job opportunities and restoring themselves to a reasonable standard of living vis-a-vis what their parents had.
Yes, John, and it goes again to the people not actually having any understanding about where their lifestyle comes from. When you come to artificial intelligence centres, I was in the United States last year, spoke to the guy that runs reliability for the US grids, because there are several of them, and he said they're now getting demands for 1 gigawatts worth of load. Now, that's a meaningless figure, except that that's how much energy you'd need to run the city of San Francisco for one data center. Now, we're going to see those things springing up all over the world as the demand for the benefits that we can get from artificial intelligence come. But when it comes to food, you're dead right. Again, people don't understand that in order to get the fertilizer that we need to feed half the world's population, it comes from a process that was invented, in fact, during the First World War, the Haber-Bosch process, where we essentially harvest the nitrogen from the atmosphere. There's plenty of it there, but plants can't eat it, turn it into ammonia and turn it into plant food. That's where most of your food comes from. So you have to have fossil fuel embedded in that industrial process. And at the moment, we haven't invented the process that could take its place. It's the same when we talk about all of these other things like making plastic and making medicines. People don't understand that most of their medicines are petrochemicals. It's a derivative of the oil industry. And what we've seen through the course of through the 20th century and up until now is that demand for all these things hasn't dropped. People haven't changed their lifestyles. We've changed the place where the energy is being burned, mainly from places like Australia and Europe, into China. But China's now burning 58% of the world's coal. Last year, the world burned more coal, oil and gas than it ever has in a single year in human history, and carbon emissions continue to rise. One of the reasons that I get agitated about this, John, is that if the world was serious about cutting carbon emissions, then I think Australia should be serious about it. But the world clearly is not serious about it, and economies which now make up 60% of the world's carbon emissions, the United States, China, India and Russia, have no intention of hitting net zero. So what's Australia doing on its 1%? If a ton of coal burned anywhere is a problem everywhere, then your problem is really in China and not in Australia.
It seems to me that the real rub in all of this and I say this with some feeling as a farmer with a son and a daughter-in-law who want to continue farming, we're being asked, and I got attacked ruthlessly by a couple of Sydney academics on this recently for not listening to the experts. And I said, well, you're actually asking us to wear an incredible cost of mitigation, and we are then, because we can't affect the outcome, have to pay the price of adaptation because we will have to adapt anyway. We have no choice. Nothing we do, the former chief scientist Alan Finkel confirmed that in the Senate, nothing we do is going to change what's going to happen. So to see the point I'm making, the costs of adaptation unfairly and unevenly lumped on people who are less well off and the productive and business and farming sector of the country, they will then have to turn around and pay the price of adaptation anyway. There will be costs with adaptation, no doubt about that. But we're going to saddle ourselves with both, while the biggest economies in the world are not going to do either.
Yeah, well, you're dead right, John. That's precisely the equation that we are facing at the moment, is because nothing that Australia does will make any difference. And if we do have to adapt, we're going to have to pay that cost as well. So one of the things that gets me about this is that we're talking about two different things. One is climate change and whether or not we think that that's a problem or a crisis. I think it's a problem. I don't think it's an existential threat, but I do think that we should do what we can and Australia's proportionate share. Well, then the next question is, what should Australia do? What is the best policy for us to work with? And the problem we've got is that particularly the wind and solar industry, and this multi-billion-dollar industry, by the way, that surrounds all of this stuff now, has changed the debate into, if you do not believe in net zero, then you are a climate change denier. Well, I'm sorry, we're talking about a policy response to a problem. So I'm saying that that's not necessarily the way to go. And I've got to say, the level of hypocrisy, John, because look around you, and I encourage everyone to do that now. Try and find something in the built environment that does not contain fossil fuel embedded in its industrial production. We use it every single day and we do not see it. So if you are looking through glasses, take them off because you can't use those anymore. If you've got clothes with any synthetic materials, take them off because you can't use that anymore. Don't lean on that desk that's been machined with tools that use any kind of energy. Don't walk on that bitumen. Don't walk on that concrete. Don't walk on that grass if it's had fertilizer put on it. So where would you end up if you took away all the fossil fuel in the world? Well, there's a program that they've already made about that. It's called Naked and Alone, John, because our entire world has been built around fossil fuels. It is embedded around us. And I entreat those people and those two academics to spend just one day, and let's make it a Friday, fossil-free Fridays. All those people who are preaching to us about the way we should live our lives should endeavour to lead at least one day of their lives, 1 week of their lives, without touching anything that has fossil fuel in it. And that includes the food that they eat, because essentially if it's been shipped to you using diesel or it's been made using fertiliser, you are actually eating fossil fuel.
It does seem to me that you've touched on this, that again, going to the issue of people understanding what's coming, we have turned ourselves inside out much more than people realise and set ourselves up for a lot more pain. Just trying to alter the way we produce electricity. But electricity is only around 36%, I think it is, of Australian emissions. Are we? Around 1% of global emissions. So electricity is responsible for about 36% of them. The rest is agriculture, feeding ourselves. It's transport, it's services, it's data centres already, such as they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the current government's making it quite plain that they want to, set some very, very ambitious targets, which will require them going way beyond electricity. People need to realise that when you start going to other sectors like agriculture and like transport, the difficulties will make the electricity production transition process look quite mild, I suspect.
John, I think of it this way. My grandfather was born in Brisbane in 1899 into a house that had no electricity, it had no running water, it had no sewerage, there were no planes in the sky, there were no cars on the road, it was horses and carts. When he died in 1967, we were 2 years away from the moonshot. He had a Ford Zephyr in the garage, he had a refrigerator, he had running water inside the house, and he had an indoor toilet. All of that is fossil fuel. If you think about what happened through the course of human history, we are creatures of fire, John. So the only reason we moved around the world, and by the way, Homo sapiens inherited fire, so we didn't actually invent it. It's so lost in history that it's part of our mythology. Where did fire come from? But that allowed us to move from Africa all the way up to the Arctic, all the way down through the Americas, and all the way down to the bottom tip of South America and across that land bridge to Australia. We could not have gotten there without fire. Through the course of human history, our economy really doesn't shift that much. It goes through very small changes. But then we find that we can burn coal. What do? We've harnessed a much denser source of power. What does that do? It begins to spin those big wheels of industry. It begins to drive steam engines. It then drives those steam boats that manage to go across the oceans. But then, and this is really quite late, we get oil. Now, you as a farmer would know this. 1 litre of diesel will drive a 40-tonne truck 1 kilometre. We never imagined that we would get such an explosive form of energy. The world runs on oil, and we managed to leave the earth and then hit the skies because of oil, because it's portable, it's light, and it's hugely combustible. It gives out an enormous amount of energy. We're going from those hugely energy-dense forms of power to really dispersed forms of power. They don't create anything like the grunt that we used to get. We think that we can do that just by setting targets. We think that the world that we've built is going to change because Chris Bowen and other energy ministers decide that there's a target that we're going to hit. No, what they will do is impose agony on the poor. They will impose it on our society. They will drive us into poverty. The reason I get so animated about this, John, is because I absolutely believe that idea that energy is life and energy is the economy. And I don't want to see that dictated to by government, because it actually has no understanding how the world actually works.
Well, I share your frustration, and I'd like to think for both of us it comes from a very deep love of our country, actually, and of our fellow Australians, and particularly the more vulnerable. You talk about energy poverty. I think it's a real problem. I think about cost of living and the fact that young people can't afford a home, and they're very exercised about it, and I understand why. But they're inclined, for example, to say, well, it's all about immigration. Actually, a lot of the decline in our living standards has to do with what we've done with the energy transition already, and yet so much more is planned. And it's so difficult. You've been in the media for so many years of your life. It is now so difficult to prosecute an argument, and so few people in public life are prepared to actually try and prosecute an argument.
Yeah, because we've signed up to a faith, John, and that's what I think that's happened with the entire environmental movement, right? So essentially, over the course of the last couple of hundred years, Western societies have ditched a widespread belief in God, a widespread belief in faith. But there is a God-shaped hole inside of everybody, and you try to fill it. And you try to fill it, most people try to fill it with something good. So I understand why people really want to care for the environment. I want to care for the environment as well. I've been in really poor countries. I lived in India. I can tell you this, poor countries do not look after the environment. People scrabble to make a living, and they'll do whatever they can to do that. And it's in those poorest countries that you'll see most of the rubbish. And it's in those poorest countries where you'll see most of the damage to the environment. And by the way, all of sub-Saharan Africa would like to get rich like us one day, and they want to stop burning dung by way of fuel. So there's a whole, continent there that's going to, at some stage, begin to progress. I hope they do, but they're going to want to burn fossil fuel to get there, John. So one of the things that gets me about all of this is we are not debating logic. We are debating a faith. And our ruling class, our elites, have essentially signed up to this faith. The media class, absolutely across a large proportion of it, has signed up to this. There's been, when you talk about making these arguments, why is it so hard? Because you can't get a lot of journalists to ask the kinds of questions that need to be asked about the people who are making these policy decisions, because they've signed up to the faith as well. So it is a very difficult argument to make, but I intend to keep making it. And I understand, I believe, and I genuinely mean this, that one day this will be decided by physics. If the lights go out, if the cost rises too much, then people will start to pay attention to what's going on. And then We need to be there to tell them, well, what's changed? Because I'll tell you what's going to happen on the east coast of Australia on our national electricity market. Now, we are running our last coal-fired power plants about as hard as we can. And despite what the government says, it's trying to keep them alive for as long as it can, because that's what's keeping our system alive. One day when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing, and probably in the middle of winter when it's really quite cold, one of those big coal-fired plants is going to give out. It'll break because of the stress that it's under. And then we'll see our energy ministers come rushing out and say, see, we told you, unreliable old power broke down. They won't say, by the way, that wind and solar was resting on its shovels doing nothing at that time. It'll all be the fault of that last bit of dispatchable power. Now, this is the thing I would say to the coalition. They have to be ready when that happens with an argument they've started making now that explains to people why that would be the case and where the real fault lies. Otherwise, once again, they're going to get cornered in an energy argument as they did in the last election.
Chris, at the risk of boring people who often tap into these conversation series that I do, the reality now is that it's 26 or 27 years since we had a major policy shift, dynamic shift in the Australian management of the Australian economy. It was a new tax system. It was 1997, 1998. We've been paralysed ever since. In fact, now is an era when we need an engaged citizenry saying we actually face greater challenges than ever. We've got to get across these debates. On the other hand, though, we need the sort of determined leadership that creates a constituency that's willing to make change. You've actually got to be able to advocate. I guess there's three questions in that. What's happened to our power of advocacy amongst our leaders? Secondly, how do we understand the role of traditional media and in particular your old abode, the ABC, with its charter to do the work that the mainstream media might not do? And thirdly, what's the role, a long question I know, of online media, where overwhelmingly now younger people particularly draw their information from?
Yeah, John, on the first one, it is, I think that politicians don't want to do hard things anymore. If they think they can get into government by doing easy things, that they will. And it seems to me that we've built up a culture of dependency, and both major parties have responsibility for this, which is essentially that the government can fix all your problems. Now, it's very difficult for a Liberal Party to make a traditional Liberal argument, which should be essentially, we want to get government out of your life rather than more government into it. But we saw during COVID, when the Liberal Party essentially, under Scott Morrison, had to bail the country out for quite a long period of time, that the coalition lost all of its capacity to say that it was the party that was best at budget management because it was shoveling out more money than we'd ever seen in our history before. And then now somehow along the way, it's also managed to lose the national security argument. So I think we've got to the stage where we aren't really capable of doing hard things. I thought that COVID was a shock to the system. I thought that things might change then, but clearly we just filled the hole again with more government support. And I think Australians have got to understand that can't keep coming forever, right? So what we are doing at the moment is that we are basically shoveling debt into the future. So people have to understand that if they want the lifestyle that they're living now, which is essentially borrowed money, that money one day has to be paid for, and that's by future generations. And that's why the argument I'd make would be to the young. If we continue to live on the pathway that we're on, a smaller workforce in future will be trying to hold this edifice up, and it simply won't stand up. In future, a future government and a future community is going to have to pay the cost for the lifestyles that we choose to live today. When it comes to the mainstream media and my old stomping ground of the ABC, and look, I've always said, look, the ABC's fed me for 19 years, so I'm not going to be a public critic of it, but nothing on it surprises me anymore. I always know where a story on the ABC is going to land, and I think that they need to be doing a bit more of the basic spade work of journalism and questioning all sides on this, and not merely deciding that one side is morally superior to the other. And that's at least the impression that I get when I watch some of the debate that's taking place there. And when it comes to online media, well, I think, John, this is the hope of the future. You look at the number of people who are watching you, and I can tell you with, now what is it, over 700,000 subscribers. The last time I was working for a mainstream media organisation was the Channel 9 News. Its highest rating program was at 6 p.m, at 6 p.m. news, and it had been falling for some time, but it had around about 1 million people watching to it. But that dropped to about, maybe 900,000 or 800,000 people at night time. So You, John, are getting as many eyeballs now as the mainstream media. And I'm glad now that there are a myriad of voices that are out there that people can listen to. And all I can say to any young person who's listening is listen widely. Listen to as many voices as you possibly can. And don't accept the things which are essentially settled truth. When anyone tells you anything, science, climate change is settled, they're telling you a lie, because all of these things are a debate. They are all a work in progress, and particularly science, because that's the way it works. You know, that you set up a thesis, you have a hypothesis, and someone comes and tries to knock it down. That's the purpose of science. So nothing is settled. This is a conversation, and there's a big difference between trying to work on a problem like climate change and what the policy solution might look like. And you've best articulated it today. If in the end we're going to pay two costs, the cost of adaptation and the cost of mitigation, we should spend our money wisely and spend it where it will do the most good, rather than trying to change the temperature of the world from Australia. We should be looking at how we can stay rich and how we can make sure that we look after those in our society that have least capacity to do it.
Well, Chris, I really am impressed by the way you go after facts, the brilliant way you present them in your writing and in your speaking, and I think the courage really to swim against the tide. Is it your impression that there's quite a substantial chunk of younger people, what the Americans call Generation Z, the under 29s, under 30s, who are beginning to sense that they haven't been fed a great deal that they can rely on? They're starting to think for themselves, that they are becoming self-educated and are beginning to wake up, that they might form the basis of a new greatest generation?
I think it's inevitable, John, that they will, and I think that we always have to have hope for our future. Like every generation looks on the last one and thinks that, that it's not as good as the generation that they were part of. I think that, the generation that you and I are part of, it had it very, very easy. Really, you think about my parents' generation, your parents' generation, when they really had to deal with depression and with war and serious warfare. So, we have, since the end of the Second World War, lived in an environment in Australia which has been peaceful. Any wars that we had were offshore. People might have fought in them, but they weren't very many people by the scheme of things. We had very, very secure lifestyles. We lived under a security blanket that was thrown out by the United States. There were all of these institutions which looked after the way that the world ran and tried to make it a more equitable place. And they worked pretty well. They certainly worked well for Australia. I know you can make arguments that elsewhere they didn't, but that Australia had it very, very good. The last time we suffered a recession in the 1980s, I know I was in it looking for work, was in the 1980s. So, we've since the 1990s on, we've known nothing but growth. What we need to now understand is the world is changing dramatically around us. The safety net that was thrown up around the world is now being shaken by the very country that set it up. Now it's starting to question whether or not it's worth its while to pay the price of being the security guarantor for the world. That's a reasonable question, but it leaves big questions for a place like Australia. But one of the things the United States is doing is it's staying energy rich. I notice now that Canada's Prime Minister is talking about being an energy superpower, not a green energy superpower, John, an energy superpower. He's talking about building pipelines to pump oil through. He's talking about liquefied natural gas, where they might well take Australia's markets in future if we decide we're not going to be in that. So what Australia has to do is to make sure that it leaves itself in the best possible condition to deal with these extremely difficult times. We are not going to do that by becoming poor. The pathway that we're on at the moment is going to guarantee that, because it won't just be changing our electricity supply or manufacturing everything that we do. It will be shutting down our major exports and pretending that we can fill that gap with yet to be invented technologies where we'll be a green energy superpower. Look, every country on earth reckons they're going to do that. So we're going to be working in a very crowded marketplace. I think Australia should do the things that it does well. And at the moment, we are an energy superpower. We need to take advantage of that.
Finally, then, for young people who are listening and who are genuinely worried about climate change and genuinely worried about the environment, they might be thinking it can't possibly be the case that nuclear energy can be done in a reasonable time frame. It can't possibly be the case that it's safe. It can't possibly be the case that it's affordable, because we haven't had an honest debate about it. We talk about integrity in politics. The Labor Party machine must have known that the overblown pricing put on nuclear by the Clean Energy Council, where they indicated, and they have an axe to grind, I think it would be fair to say, that nuclear would cost somewhere between 115 billion and 600 billion. Who knows over what time span, who knows on what basis those numbers were made. But of course, the Labor Party jumped on 600 billion. They pumped it out everywhere. And only today I had quite a well-informed person say to me, "Oh, but it sounds so expensive." What would you say to young people, firstly, about the role of nuclear energy as I understand it, apart from hydro, the only really clean source of energy that's reliable, the only one? And secondly, the reality that just about everybody, every sophisticated country except Australia is going down that road. Why are we cleverer than those other countries?
Well, it's a very good question, John. You have to question why we think we know so much more than the rest of the world when the rest of the world has embraced nuclear energy. I would start by saying to young people this, that is, that climate change is a problem, but the world is not about to end, and you should look at the documents that have been produced by the International Panel on Climate Change and find out what it actually has to say about where we're headed, because what we've seen is a complete change in language over time. Right, we've gone from global warming to climate change, which means it could have been anything, and then we get to extreme weather, and we get to a climate emergency. And what we've done is we've managed to terrify a generation of the young about an end of times scenario that doesn't actually exist in any of the literature. Climate change is a problem. It is not an existential threat. So that's good news. We should celebrate that. But we do need to deal with the problem. And if nuclear energy, John, had been invented yesterday, it would now be being hailed by the world as a world-saving technology. Because what do we have? The densest form of power that we know of, which is capable of providing energy and heat, and that spinning wheel that I was talking about before that stabilizes a grid. So it can do everything that we want from a base load power, and the fuel source, the fuel cost of it is really quite cheap. So it would be, and it's got, and on top of all of that, it is zero emissions. And I'd look too at the government's plan. So if you look at the government's plan for the Eastern Grid, what's known as the National Electricity Market, the system that they're building to get to 82% renewables will not function without 15 gigawatts of gas. Again, it's a meaningless figure, but that is 15 cities of 1 million people. That's how much gas needs to be in the system to ensure that the system is stabilised and to ensure that we have 100% backup of it when it decides to go offline, and we're never going to know when that's going to be. People talk about storage. You cannot have storage that lasts you over a course of more than a couple of days to try and cover the gap that's left by wind and solar when they leave a big hole in generation. You need a dispatchable source of fuel. So as long as you leave the gas there, you're going to have a carbon footprint. If you're really concerned about getting rid of that as the last piece in the puzzle, then you'd put nuclear energy in there to do that job. And then you would actually have a system that was capable of delivering a zero emissions electricity system. We would be nowhere near the point of being able to get all fossil fuel out of our built environment. That, I think, and we will find, is going to take a couple of 100 years if we stay on this path. But like I say, every single year, except for the global financial crisis and COVID, the world's carbon emissions have risen since 1992, when we began this carbon-cutting journey at the Rio Earth Summit. So the world is not serious about cutting carbon emissions. What the world has done is to move where the carbon is burnt from some of the industrialised countries to places like China. And what have we seen? China, the more energy it burns, the richer it becomes. And the less that is used in the Western world, the poorer it becomes. The United States has now worked out that that's not an equation it wants to follow anymore. Europe has yet to get the memo, and so has the UK. But over time, governments will be forced by their populations to change, because somewhere along the pathway to poverty, John, people will riot. There will be a revolt.
Well, as you said, people who are experiencing real poverty are not going to care about the environment. So, by way of summary, it might be worth, I think, just again making the point that it does seem that, and you've alluded to this, that this is quasi-religious, that it's as though we're offending Mother Earth, Gaia, as some Greens actually call the Earth. That's pagan language from the Greco-Roman era. Mother Earth, Goddess Earth, and we're offending us. Human beings are her. Human beings are the problem. That is the language, I think, of guilt, of conscience, of wanting to make good, to atone, but it's self-flagellation without hope and without mercy. And therefore, surely we should be looking for something more hopeful. I'm prompted to say that by you saying we ought to be rejoicing that the ICCP, in fact, does not predict the end of humanity as we know it. I'm old enough to remember a major Australian newspaper, when all of this first blew up, reporting breathlessly on its front page that by 2025, the Pacific Ocean would be lapping the doors of the Sydney Opera House. It's 2025. But it's taken on a religious nature, a quasi-religious nature, I would say a false religious nature, that ought to be rejected. It's without mercy, it's without real redemption, it's without hope.
Oh, absolutely, John. And it struck me a long time ago, having spent a little over 3 years in a Catholic seminary, that this religion had all of the tenets of a religion. Essentially was that you have sinned, you will be punished, you must atone. Right down to food prohibitions, John, the sorts of things like as Catholics didn't used to eat meat on Fridays. Well, you know, environmentalists, you don't supposed to be eating meat ever. We're going to change all of that sort of stuff. So it has all of the elements of a religion. But the one thing, and I think this is why, and you put your finger on it, that things will change in time without hope. Because people are constantly fed this diet of doom. It's always worse than it's going. You know, every time we read one of these stories, oh, it's worse than you thought it was. Things are going to be worse than they are. We have to go that much harder. We always need to seek for more ambition. We have to flagellate ourselves more into order to hit this ever receding horizon that's being set up by a group of experts. So, look, I think that eventually, if people can find a way of seeing some hope in all of this, to be told, yes, you know, I think now, I don't want to argue the toss over climate change. The globe is warming. Humans certainly have played a role in that. We need to do something about that, but we need to do what's sensible rather than what's impossible. Setting up ourselves an impossible task is just meaning we're setting ourselves up for failure, and we need to provide the young with some sense of hope. Through the course of my lifetime, I've seen huge changes in the environment, John, very positive changes. In the 1980s, when I was travelling from the western suburbs of Sydney into the city of Sydney, you'll remember this, it used to be covered with a smog haze. There used to be a smog alert that was on television. We don't do that anymore because we managed to change the fuels that we used. When I was going to the south coast of New South Wales as a kid, there were no whales. You never saw humpback whales along the coast because we'd basically hunted them to extinction. Now apparently there are 40,000 whales that make up their way up and down that coastline every year, and everyone can see them. When I was a kid at Bateman's Bay, I'd never seen a seal anywhere in the water, but there are seals now around the waterways. A wealthy country using its wealth to look after its environment is what Australia should be hoping to be. There is enormous hope for the future as long as we husband our wealth and we look after our future generations by not squandering the resources that we have today and having them pay for the future.
Well, here's to logic, here's to hope, here's to calm reason. May they win out sooner rather than later before we do so much damage we find ourselves permanently structurally weakened and diminished.
John, always great to talk to you, mate.
Thanks, Chris.